Hey guys, this is Dave with Audio Win, and I have another budget IEM, the new Celest WYVERN Black or Abyss Edition, and it's priced at $29, so we are starting to get into the ultra budget range, which means this is going to be competing with the likes of the Warner, Dolce, Hola, Chew2 DSP, and a bunch of others. So as usual, we'll go over what's included in the box, we'll talk about the specifications and design, and then we will get into the sound. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. So as far as accessories, this is pretty standard for a budget set. You have the IEMs and cable, and you also have a small selection of ear tips. It does not include a case or a pouch. Again, this is priced at $29. It has a single dynamic driver configuration. The housing is made out of resin, but I have to say the build and design is exceptional for this being a budget set. As a matter of fact, this is easily one of the nicest IEMs I've seen in this price range, and you guys know aesthetics is pretty important to me. Now, apparently the design was inspired by a wyvern, which is a type of dragon, but more specifically the scales of a dragon. And if you look at the faceplate, you can see that sparkly scale-like pattern. And what's really cool is it actually kind of changes from blue to purple depending on the lighting. So the design is really quite beautiful, and it doesn't really strike me as just a simple budget set. And the fit is good also, as it is a little on the smaller side. And if you look at the shape on the inside, you can see they went with kind of a semi-custom approach, which really helps to ensure comfortable and secure fit, which it absolutely does provide that for me. The cable is also pretty nice. It has a 3.5 termination with 2-pin connectors at the earpieces. And while the general look and feel of the cable does strike me as being a fairly typical budget style cable, it's actually very manageable, and surprisingly, I didn't have really too many issues with memory or tangling, so I can definitely appreciate that. But the bottom line is, considering this is only $29, I have to say the build quality and design of both the IEMs and cable is much better than I would have expected. But what about sound? Well, let's talk about that. Okay, so let's talk about the sound of the wyvern. So when I first sat down and kind of started running through my test tracks, the wyvern signature sounded pretty familiar, and it kind of reminded me of a set that I really used to like a lot. It was actually one of my go-to budget sets, and again, this has been a while back, and that set was the Chew2. So I pulled that set out, and sure enough, while there were some differences in the upper mids and treble, the mids and lower mids and bass sounded kind of similar. And if you remember, the Chew2 was tuned to Moondrop's VDSF target. So the Wyvern's signature takes kind of a similar approach, in my opinion. So what that means in terms of its general presentation is that it's going to lean towards a Harmon, or at least a Harmon-ish style tuning, but with a little more mid-bass. And it also reminds me of the Kiwi Ears Cadenza as well. But let's go ahead and break down the sound, and we'll start with the bass. So in terms of bass quantity, I would say for this style of tuning, it's just about right. And while I do think my attention was pulled a little more towards the upper mids or the vocals, when you look at the bass curve, more specifically the mid bass, because of that extra mid bass energy, when you combine the mid bass energy with the rest of the bass, it is enough to balance out the upper mids for the most part. And it also has a pretty decent amount of sub bass as well. So you've got good sub bass extension. Of course, that lays a nice foundation for the rest of the bass frequencies. So you have good bass presence with a little extra mid bass warmth, which also brings some richness to male vocals, and it also helps add some of that mid-bass punch to kick drums as well. But at the same time, it does also introduce some bass bleed into the lower mids, which really isn't a big deal, and that's definitely a nitpick at this price point. Now, as far as dynamics, I would say it's decent, and it's actually probably better than I would have expected at this price point. And I would say that about the bass presentation as a whole. It's just very, very good considering this is a budget set. Now, as for the mid-range, there is somewhat of a recess in the mid-range. So some instruments that land squarely in the mid-range, so maybe certain guitar notes or keyboard notes, they can sound a little bit pulled back or maybe a little further away. And again, you also have some warmth in the low mids. And when you combine that mid-bass warmth with the small amount of recession in the mid-range, sometimes certain notes can sound a little too heavy and even unnatural. Again, another nitpick at this price point. And just to remind you, that's probably one of my biggest complaints about budget sets in general, because it seems like the vast majority of them suffer from unnaturalness in one way or another. Even some of the best sets I own, even the WYVERN, which I feel is one of the most natural sounding budget sets out there. But going back to the WYVERN, as you move into the upper mids, again, this is where I think most of the listeners' attention is likely to be drawn to or focused on, simply because of the amount of energy you have in the pinna gain region. So vocals, especially female vocals, are going to be a little more prominent in the mix, more prominent than I generally prefer. However, that also means you are going to have a little more upper mid clarity as well. So that may appeal to some listeners. Now, the treble is what I would consider to be a little more on the relaxed side. So it's going to be easier on the ears, but it's not going to sound as engaging. And while I do feel like there is enough treble energy as to give cymbal strikes and some of those higher stringed instruments enough room to cut through, they aren't necessarily going to give you a ton of detail. Now, as far as upper treble energy, there is some upper treble presence past in K, enough to give you a little bit of that airiness and shimmer, but it's still not really going to give you much in terms of micro details. Now, speaking of details, while I would consider the technical performance of the WYVERN to be very good for the budget category, it's still not great. Detail levels are just okay. Soundstage is decent, not wide, but definitely wide enough to give some sense of left to right spacing. There really isn't much in terms of forward depth and layering. However, again, left to right positional cues are good enough to place instruments within the sound field. So again, the WYVERN's technicalities are about as good as can be expected for this being in the budget category. So I guess the bigger question is, how does it compare to other budget sets? Well, I will tell you right now, it's as solid as they come. As a matter of fact, I think it's as good as the WYVERN. You know, again, depending on your personal tuning preference, I will say I prefer the upper mid-range tuning of the WYVERN and probably the Dolce tube, because they're both just a little smoother and a little more relaxed. Again, that's just my preference, but in almost every other regard, the WYVERN can at least perform on par with both of those sets. And I actually think I prefer it on the whole even a little more than the Dolce. So I guess what that really means is that of the sets I've heard or reviewed since the release of the WYVERN, which I believe was around the beginning of 2023, this is the first set to compete on the same level as the WYVERN. Now, in terms of design and build, the WYVERN doesn't even come close to the WYVERN in my opinion. The WYVERN is much more beautiful and has a much better build in my opinion. So the bottom line is that the WYVERN easily gets my top recommendation. This is an excellent budget set in my opinion. So that concludes my review of the Celest WYVERN Black or Abyss Edition. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch. If you like my content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would please like this video, please share this video. I hope you guys have an awesome day.